Hello, this is Jo Genders here from the Quality Assurance Unit. Thanks for joining me for this mini workshop on designing assessment for the English 2010 syllabus with a particular focus on Dimension 3. When teachers design effective assessment for English, they need to select relevant objectives from the three dimensions: understanding and responding to context, understanding and controlling textual features, and creating and evaluating meaning. Teachers select the relevant objectives that align with task requirements. In Dimension 3, the two separate cognitive skills of creating and evaluating are combined. So students use and evaluate ideas, attitudes, and values. They create and evaluate perspectives and representations, and they use and evaluate aesthetic features. The syllabus standards separate these two skills to allow teachers to design assessment which reflects the purposes of the assessable categories, that is, expository texts, imaginative text, and persuasive or reflective texts. This separation also allows schools to design assessment instruments and standards matrices that align with assessment requirements. So what is meaning in Dimension 3? Well, meaning is ideas, attitudes, and values. Those ideas, attitudes, and values are communicated by perspectives and representations of concepts, identities, times, and places, and through choices in aesthetic features to communicate those. So, for example, students might analyse how Shakespeare constructs attitudes about race in Othello by choices he makes in the representation of characters, setting, plot, dialogue, imagery, staging, etc. Similarly, students might construct particular attitudes about teenagers in a short story through choices they make in representing character, setting, plot, and dialogue, and through the use of aesthetic features. So when teachers make decisions about which objectives, which cognitive skill, either creating or evaluating, are relevant to an assessment instrument, they should ask themselves this key question. This will help them to determine which objectives to assess. So are students creating their own meaning in a text, that is, ideas, attitudes, and values communicated through perspectives and representations and using aesthetic features, or are they analysing meaning constructed by somebody else, somebody else's text? So really, at essence, the question is, where is the meaning located? If teachers can answer this key question, they'll be able to use it to make good decisions about assessment design. So in expository responses, students analyse the meaning found in another's text. In this sample question for an analytical exposition fitting into the expository category, students are required to analyse how somebody else, that is, F. Scott Fitzgerald, how somebody else has constructed meaning in their own text. The students are clearly being asked to analyse. So let's have a look at how the evaluating meaning objectives are fleshed out in that task. Students will need to analyse what attitudes about the American dream are being presented in the novel by somebody else. Therefore, they're evaluating the meaning constructed by somebody else. Students will need to explore how Fitzgerald uses concepts, identities, times, and places, maybe characterization, setting, plot, dialogue, in order to communicate particular attitudes about the American dream. The meaning is found in Fitzgerald's text. And students will need to analyse how aesthetic features are used in order to construct that meaning, in order to support the attitude that has been constructed in the text. So therefore, students are clearly being assessed on the evaluating meaning objectives of Dimension 3 here. The standards matrix aligns with that task. It uses the evaluating meaning aspects. And if you look closely, you'll notice that the generic reference to texts has been replaced by the text that is under analysis. That is, The Great Gatsby. You might like to pause this recording now to review this task criteria sheet in more detail. So in imaginative responses, students are constructing or creating their own meaning in their own texts. A genuine imaginative response will require students to construct their own meaning. That is, it will require them to use ideas, attitudes, and values to influence audiences. It will require them to create perspectives and representations of concepts, identities, times, and places, and to use aesthetic features for effects. While the imaginative response might arise from a text that has been studied, for example, a play, the instrument does not assess student evaluation or analysis of that text. So in this sample imaginative text, where students are required to construct an epistolary narrative, which is a letter with an embedded narrative, they're asked to adopt the role of a character from a play that they have studied. But you'll see that this task is very clearly imaginative. It uses Othello as a starting point, but it's not assessing student analysis of the meaning that Shakespeare created in the original text. That is, they're not required to analyse how Shakespeare has constructed attitudes about race, about gender, about family in the text. They haven't been asked to evaluate how he does that with reference to his choices in character or dialogue or imagery or setting, and they're certainly not being asked to analyse the aesthetic features that Shakespeare has drawn upon in order to construct that meaning. They are creating their own meaning, their own ideas, their own attitudes and values, their own representations and perspectives, their own aesthetic features. So when we break that down with reference to the 3 objectives, the students will need to engage with this question: what attitudes and values will you communicate? What meaning are you trying to communicate to your reader or audience? How will you represent that meaning? What choices will you make in concepts, identities, times and places? So maybe in characterization, setting, plot, dialogue, staging, timing, perspective. How will you represent those things in order to create meaning? And what aesthetic features will you choose to create meaning? It's very clear that students in this task are not being asked to explore, analyze or evaluate how Shakespeare does any of those things. They are required to construct it for themselves. So the standard matrix naturally aligns with the task because it assesses the creating meaning aspects of Dimension 3. If you look closely, you'll notice that the generic text has been replaced by the text that the student constructs, that is, the epistolary narrative. You'll note that Othello is not included here. There is no reference to Othello in the criteria sheet because students are not analysing Othello. They are creating an epistolary narrative. When we look at persuasive or reflective texts, students might be required to either demonstrate the evaluating meaning or the creating meaning objectives in Dimension 3 in a task. Teachers will need to make the decision about which ones are relevant by asking themselves that key question. Will students be creating their own meaning, or will the meaning be found in another's text? So if we look at this sample one, which does assess the evaluating meaning aspects of Dimension 3, students are clearly required to analyse somebody else's text, that is, a political cartoonist's text. They're being asked to evaluate how the choices in concepts, identities, times or places are used to represent those particular ideas or attitudes, and they'll be required to analyse the aesthetic features that are used to communicate that meaning. It's very clear that the students are evaluating somebody else's text. So if we explore that with the objectives, they'll need to have a look at what ideas or attitudes about the topic are being presented in the cartoons. How is that meaning being communicated and constructed through the choices the cartoonist makes, and particular reference to the aesthetic features that the cartoonist might make in order to communicate their meaning. So when we look at the criteria sheet that aligns with that task, we'll see that the students are doing an analytical feature article which assesses the evaluation of meaning because the meaning is found in somebody else's text. The students are being asked to analyse meaning found in political cartoons. You'll notice that political cartoons has replaced the generic reference to texts in the criteria sheets here. Now the students will be writing a persuasive feature article in order to do the analysis, and teachers will be able to make decisions about the students' feature article and their use of generic features, the selection of subject matter, the use of roles and relationships, the use of textual features to achieve purposes and effects by matching evidence in the response to the objectives in Dimensions 1 and 2. Let's look at this sample persuasive text which assesses creating meaning. Students are required to construct an election campaign speech. They need to construct their own ideas, attitudes and values about leadership. They need to construct their own representations and perspectives. They need to choose their own aesthetic features. The meaning lies within the student's own text, and therefore will be assessing the creating meaning aspects of Dimension 3. When we look at it with reference to the objectives, students will be considering what attitudes and values they will communicate. The meaning lies in their text. They are creating the meaning. How will they do that? Through the representation of concepts, identities, times and places. And what aesthetic features will they use in order to communicate the meaning that they are constructing? So the criteria sheet with reference to Dimension 3 will of course use the creating meaning aspects of Dimension 3. The generic text has been replaced with campaign speech, that the student's campaign speech is the text in which the meaning will be found. So when teachers design effective assessment using the English syllabus, they need to ensure that it provides opportunities for students to demonstrate the dimensions and objectives across the range of standards. There are support resources on the Senior Assessment Hub, including Senior Assessment Evaluation Tool and Designing Effective Assessment Instruments. There are also a number of audio-visual videos there designed to support you in your development of assessment design. On the English page specifically, the Senior Assessment Hub, there are a range of assessment instruments that are designed to demonstrate to teachers how to design effective assessment using the syllabus standards and objectives, and how to make good decisions about which aspect of Dimension 3 is most relevant to the task. I encourage you to look at the samples there. The State Panel Report has been published from 2014 on that link there on the QCAA website, and there is particular advice there around Dimension 3 and the choices that teachers might make in order to decide which side of the equation, i.e. are the students analysing somebody else's meaning and therefore evaluating meaning, or are they constructing and creating their own meaning and therefore creating meaning with reference to Dimension 3. My contact details are there, my direct phone number as well as my email address. I encourage you to get in contact if you do need some more advice. Thank you for joining me for this mini workshop, and I hope that it has been helpful.